The trafficking of firearms is a lucrative criminal enterprise, and we need to do everything we can to make it more difficult for those crimes to be committed, and then create real consequences. But as I said earlier, it's not just about controlling the supply of guns. It's also about controlling the demand for guns. And there are demands among our young people. If people are afraid, if our kids are afraid, some of them might be tempted to acquire a gun to protect themselves. If a gang is in a dispute with another gang over turf for whatever reason, then they may be inclined to go and get their hands on guns to advance their own criminal purposes. We've got to work in our communities to keep our kids out of those gangs and to help our kids feel safe and secure in their own communities. So that fear is the greatest enemy in public safety, in my opinion, because when people become fearful, they make mistakes and they do the wrong thing. We have been working towards the announcement of the prohibition. It's the first and very important step of what will be several important steps that our government will take to keep Canadians safe. I think I will always be haunted by the realization that if we'd only been able to bring in this prohibition sooner, it might have made a difference in Nova Scotia. That's perhaps unlikely, but we'll never know. It might have made a difference. It might have made a difference in Nova. That's perhaps unlikely, but we'll never know. But we know in our neighborhoods, and for a lot of the gangs and people that commit violence in our cities, handguns are the weapon of choice because they're concealable and they're deadly. And so we know there's three ways in which those guns come into our communities. They're smuggled across the border, they're stolen from legal gun owners, and in some cases they're purchased legally and then sold illegally by gun traffickers. And so those are the three ways the guns come into the community.
This display of firearms in front of you is of the 62 firearms seized, 58 were traced, 4 were untraceable, 4 of the AR-15 types were untraceable, no serial numbers, no make and model. Of the remaining 58 that were traced, 57 were traced to the United States, to US, primarily Arizona and Texas. And only one of these firearms was traced to Ontario. It was a stolen firearm from a break and enter back in 2021. So in essence, the overwhelming, whatever that is, 98% of these firearms are traced from the US. So that speaks to the Chief's comment about our border integrity and the flow of illegal crime guns coming up from the United States. That concludes my comments, subject to your questions for the Chief and I.
We're going to shut down all 3 sources of supply. We're going to do that by new resources at the border, but also new offenses, new penalties for gun smugglers. For those who steal them, we're going to bring in new rules that every handgun needs to be stored in a secure gun or a safe or a vault, and we'll define how strong that has to be so that they can't be easily stolen. And for people who buy them legally and then sell them illegally, they need to get caught. So I've got to make sure that the police have the tools they need to catch and deter these people and prosecute them. And then when they do prosecute them, that means new offenses and new penalties. Like these weapons are used for killing people. And so there's not a lot of support among hunters and farmers. And so part of the pushback is what we call deception and obfuscation. They try to suggest that no, you're going to ban shotguns, which are used for hunting, and that's not true. There's a lot of misinformation that they'll put out. And I don't care about that, to be honest with you. I only care.
Since C-21 was first introduced on May the 30th, our understanding of the bill was that it covered three main areas. It was a handgun freeze, it covered a new proposed red flag regime, and also covered airsoft. The big problem with this amendment, I understand the good-natured intent behind it, but we as committee members have not had enough time to properly consult with constituents, with hunters, with farmers who may be adversely impacted by this. And for this amendment, this very substantial amendment to drop on our lap at the 11th hour is an abusive process in my...
And are you familiar with the G4 amendment?
That's the one that speaks to centerfire semi-automatic rifles?
Yes, a firearm that is a rifle or shotgun that is capable of discharging centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner and that is designed to accept a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity greater than 5 cartridges of the type for which the firearm was originally designed. So I'm asking about G4, and that's a very all-inclusive amendment, just that paragraph alone. It's open-ended, it could really add any firearm in the future, and that's what we're looking for the interpretation today, right? Is it on the list? Because we're looking for a definitive answer from you, Mr. Smith or Mr. Daly, about are these going to be captured in this new list of prohibited hunting rifle bans that the Prime Minister has laid before us? And you're saying, are you saying that they're not going to be impacted by this legislation, or are you saying that they are going to be impacted by the legislation?
Worried? About what? Hey, don't worry about that. Take a load off. Don't think about it. Look over here. Relax, guy. Did you say hostile takeover of Canada? No, relax there, fella. Taking over Canada? Me? Hey, you need a rest, fella. You may have noticed some changes to your country. Don't worry about that. The changes will continue. Everybody relax. Take a rest. Put your feet up. Those dogs are barking.
I'm saying neither. What I said was, in your response to the question whether you're on the list, I answered whether they were on the list or not. The impact of the evergreening clause, the semi-automatic centerfire clause that you mentioned earlier, was not part of the question and not part of the answer either. Okay, well, let's keep going, because I think we're looking for clear answers today, and we're still not getting them. I think law-abiding firearms owners know that they're going to be included by that paragraph. And for you to kind of say, well, no.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, point of order.
Mr. Van Bynen, point of order, please.
Statements made by the member are speculative. The amendments or any changes that might be contemplated for that schedule have not been dealt with, as been mentioned earlier. So it's an inappropriate comment.
So with that said, I would like to try and do a little bit of what we were doing last time, which is to just get some clarity for folks out there that are watching this and have been bombarded by messages that the government is coming, that I believe there was some narrative out there that the Bloc, the NDP, and the Liberals are coming for every single hunting rifle and shotgun out there, and we've made it clear time and again that we are not. That is not the intention. We've all spent time discussing these amendments, this amendment with our friends, with our families, in this committee, with constituents. I have heard from my constituents who have said that it is very important for them to make sure that we get this right so that we don't lose the opportunity to make once-in-a-generation advances in protecting Canadians. We've also heard from extreme views who have chosen to turn this into a culture war, bringing racism, bringing misogyny, bringing all kinds of other vitriol and hate into this conversation. And the emails that some of them send are a reminder of why some people, frankly, should not have firearms. But it does not mean that they represent the vast, vast majority of gun owners in this country, and I want to make that very clear. And I think that those that choose to use racism and misogyny and, calls to violence and these types of tropes actually do not advance the cause that many people who have reached out to us with good intentions and goodwill seek to do. And as I said last week, I think it's really important for everyone on this committee, regardless of their political party, to denounce those views, to denounce the misogyny, the racism, the hate that has come from a lot of folks on the extreme right who are using using the work of others to be able to carry legal firearms as to promote some other sort of rhetoric of hate. And so I hope that we'll all be able to do that together.
In America, it's a little bit different. I remember after, you may recall this, there was a terrible, tragic mass shooting at a little elementary school in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, and 22 little children were killed.
We moved from obnoxious aggression to all of us demonstrating manipulative insincerity. From that point forward, he would say things like, "I really want to support you guys in getting this thing done," which was clearly not true. I would say things like, "It's good working with you," which it really wasn't. And negotiations continued, and the deal did in fact get done. But from that point forward, there was a sort of stain on the relationship between the two companies, which never quite went away. And that was my doing.
And I remember going, because I was vice president of Major City Chiefs at the time, and I went down to Washington with my colleagues from the big cities across North America. We went to the White House and we went to Capitol Hill, and we said, now, if not now, when? When would you ever be able to ban these weapons after they'd been used in the most horrific of crimes? And the poor Americans said, oh, now is not the time and it's too hard. And I felt sorry for them. And in Canada, we have a different legal framework. So that fear is the greatest enemy in public safety, in my opinion, because when people become fearful, they make mistakes and they do the wrong thing.
So that fear is the greatest enemy in public safety, in my opinion, because when people become fearful, they make mistakes and they do the wrong thing.
A different culture, a different tradition, and frankly, very different values. We value each other more, I believe, and we don't believe it's necessary to arm ourselves to protect ourselves. From fellow Canadians. And so we have prohibited these weapons. And by the way, most sensible countries in the world have done exactly the same thing. New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, most of European countries that have very similar values to ours, have acknowledged there is no place for these guns in their society or in ours. And so we've all taken the sensible step of prohibiting them from our countries. In Canada, the ownership of and the possession of firearms is a privilege, not a right. And it's a privilege earned by people who obey the law, who follow all the rules and regulations that we have put in place for the safe, legal, and responsible use of firearms.
And I want them also to remember its relevance to other tragic crimes in Canada. These are the type of weapons that were used at École Polytechnique to murder 14 innocent women, that were used in Quebec at a mosque to kill 6 worshippers. The same type of weapons that were used to kill in Moncton the RCMP officers, or Fredericton police officers in Fredericton, or the RCMP in Meyerthorpe.
Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie once said, "Show people as one thing and only one thing over and over again, and that's what they become."
Ontario Provincial Police were chasing after the father of 18-month-old Jamison Shapiro amid a reported child abduction. In Kawartha Lakes in Cottage Country, officers reached a rural road and were given this crucial warning over their radio.
Just be advised, there's a child in that vehicle. There's a child in the vehicle.
1 minute later, an officer raises an alarm about the suspect.
He's pretty desperate. He had a gun to his head.
The father's truck careens off the road, injuring one officer. Then a man is heard shouting a command, followed by a flurry of gunshots. It's unclear who's heard firing. Little Jamison was found dead with a single gunshot wound.
We ran on a platform that we were going to strengthen gun control, and that we were going to make investments in kids and communities that were going to make our communities safer. And we became the government, and so we made a promise to Canadians, and and we have every intention of keeping it.
Has anyone in your party or in your government been able to demonstrate that licensed gun owners represent a disproportionate risk to public safety?
No,
no, I don't think they have, right?
In fact, Rod, if
represent a disproportionate risk to public safety?
No,
no, I don't think they have, right?
In fact, Rod, if
gun ownership in Canada, in this country, is a privilege and not a right. It's a privilege that's predicated on the strict adherence to our laws, our regulations, and our restrictions. It's a principle that's based on the fact that firearms in Canada are intended for use for hunting and for sports purposes. We do not arm ourselves in this country to protect ourselves from our fellow citizens. We rely on the rule of law, not the end of a gun, for
to stop.
Something's wrong with our justice system. Something's wrong with people who didn't realize he's a serious offender when for years he's been beating women. Like, why didn't we know? Why didn't we acknowledge the seriousness of this person's violent behavior?
We have problems getting convictions that keep women alive. You know, well-meaning adults who disagree could sit at a table and figure out. Because we have enough information.
Why is that not happening? In 2015, why is that not happening?
I don't know. There's no reason for it to not happen.
We do not arm ourselves in this country to protect ourselves from our fellow citizens. We rely on the rule of law, not the end of a
See, I'll just tell you my own personal belief. I believe that firearm ownership in Canada, in the United States it is a constitutional right, but in Canada it's not a right, it's a privilege.
I'm aware of that. We're not debating that.
And it's very much a privilege earned by people who obey our laws and restrictions. And those, in the United States it is a constitutional right, but in Canada it's not a right, it's a privilege. In the United States it is a constitutional right, but in Canada it's not a right, it's a privilege. It's a privilege. It's a privilege. It's a privilege. It's a privilege.
People who are suffering from mental health issues are not in and of themselves dangerous. But unfortunately, in some circumstances, it can become dangerous. And when there is a presence of a firearm in those situations, those dangerous situations can become deadly. So we'll keep guns out of those situations.
The guns used in the Nova Scotia mass murder were purchased in the U.S. and smuggled here. So to begin with, would this ban that you've introduced had any impact on that situation?
And the answer to that is yes, Evan.
And for those who aren't, there needs to be rules and regulations to control their behavior. And if they refuse to be, to be law-abiding, then there are consequences for that. And for those who aren't, there needs to be rules and regulations to control their behavior. And if they refuse to be law-abiding, then there are consequences for that.
If I may, I have been very upfront and clear that the overwhelming majority of firearm owners in this country are in fact law-abiding, responsible, and conscientious about how they acquire their firearms, how they store them, how they use them, and how they dispose of them.
And at the same time, I'm always willing to acknowledge the overwhelming majority of hunters and farmers and sport shooters in this country are law-abiding. They're responsible and conscientious. They deserve our respect because they earn our respect, because they adhere to our laws and all of the rules, and they're careful and thoughtful about how they purchase, use, and store their firearms. And for those I want to be very clear that the vast majority of gun owners in Canada are responsible and law-abiding citizens. They purchase their guns legally, they store them securely, they use them responsibly, and they dispose of them appropriately. And they're certainly not to blame for this violence. We know that Canadian hunters and farmers and sport shooters are among the most safety-conscious firearm owners in the world. The people that bought these guns, they're law-abiding Canadians too. I don't agree with their choice of weapons. I think there's no place for these weapons in our society. But when they bought them, it was legal to do so. And so I have to bring in legislation and get a budget to have a buyback program, because so that I want to treat these people fairly.
Laws and restrictions have been put in place to fulfill our greatest responsibility, which is public safety.
We follow those rules.
And we do.
No matter how ridiculous.
The next time I saw Larry, I stopped him and I said, "I'm sorry about that email. I realize that you're right and I'm wrong." There were just two problems with saying that. The first one was that I didn't believe what I was saying. I was sort of lying. It was the false apology. And the second problem was that Larry knew it. Larry's got a pretty good BS meter. And he sort of looked at me, didn't say anything, but just looked at me like I was a pigeon that had pooped on his shoulder, and walked off down the hall. It was one of those moments that's so tangibly painful. The guy sitting next to me sort of patted me on the shoulder and said, "He likes it better when you disagree with him."
I've heard your advocacy and from many of your members saying that gun ownership should be a right, like as a property right. And I've also heard, unfortunately, and I think it is most unfortunate, some of your members suggesting that they need to carry those weapons for personal protection. That's not the law in Canada.
AK-type rifles, one of which was loaded with 61 rounds of 7.62 ammunition, 5 AR-15 type carbine-style rifles, 51 semi-automatic handguns, 31 firearm magazines, and a total of 132 rounds of assorted caliber ammunition. At the time of his arrest, Mr. Zaidi was in personal possession of 2 firearms. The second party, Mr. Simpson, was located and arrested at a restaurant in the area of Kennedy Road and Ellesmere Road. He was also found to be in possession of one of the firearms in front of you at the time of his arrest.
Well, I won't mention any specific models because, again, we're still in the middle of consulting and trying to develop an impact analysis on exactly what type of firearms are used by hunters and will these changes have an adverse impact on their lifestyle. We don't have this information yet. In fact, officials, when they first appeared before this committee, could not provide us this information because the government itself had not conducted its own impact analysis before tabling this amendment. So again, we like to make decisions based on facts and based on properly informed opinions of expert witnesses. We have not had the opportunity to engage either of those avenues with this amendment.
Gun violence in Toronto has exploded over the past 6 years. It's happened because our politicians 6 years ago effectively banned our police from doing street checks. And now other parts of the country look like they're about to make the same mistake, the most recent example being in Alberta. A street check is a fundamental tool of police intelligence gathering. What the police do is they interview people on the street who aren't charged with a crime to gather information about what's going on in the community. They record the information, the name of the person, and they put it into a central police database. So it's also known as carding. Now, carding works. In 2005, after a particularly violent year of gun violence that became known as the Summer of the Gun, Bill Blair, the then Toronto police chief, who's now Justin Trudeau's public safety minister, introduced a policy of enhanced street checks. Between 2005 and 2014, the number of shootings in Toronto dropped by 32%, and the number of people killed and injured in them dropped by 55%. But after carding was abandoned in 2014 because of allegations the practice was racist, the number of shootings in Toronto have gone up 178% from 2014 to 2019, and they've gone up, the people injured and killed, that number's gone up 178%. And this year, even with the pandemic, is the second worst year for shootings, the worst year being last year. Now, there were problems with carding or street checks. Some police officers abused the practice. And there was an informal quota system, which meant that black people, innocent black people, were being disproportionately stopped and questioned by police. But carding was never supposed to be abandoned. The then government of Kathleen Wynne, the former Liberal Premier of Ontario, was supposed to introduce a regulation that would protect the rights of people interviewed by the police and let the police do their job. But even the judge who reviewed that policy for the province said it was unworkable, and the policy fell into disuse. And so now we're leaving the whirlwind of runaway gun violence, and our politicians won't talk about it because they're scared if they do, they'll be accused of racism. So the only advice I have for people in the rest of Canada is don't make the mistake that we made in Toronto. I'm Laurie Goldstein of the Toronto Sun. We're always interested in hearing your views, and please follow us on Facebook and our YouTube channel.
Finally, we will soon implement a mandatory buyback program to get these weapons of war off of our streets for good. Building safer communities, taking action at the border, banning assault weapons, buying them back, addressing the root causes of gun crime are all of the things that we need to do as part of a comprehensive strategy to end gun violence and to make sure that our communities are safe.
Well, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great honor and privilege to be speaking on Bill C-21. And at the outset, I'd like to be saying that I will be sharing my time with the member for Glengarry Prescott Russell. Mr. Speaker, there's an establishment in my riding, which is in the middle of Toronto, a great family establishment called Playtime Bowling. And it's a place where mothers and fathers can take their children, their loved ones, to kick back at the end of a busy week, where they can distract themselves with a little bit of close time with the ones that they care for, the ones that they work for every day. I take my girls there, like many families do in my community. And the reason why I'm referring to this establishment at the outset of my remarks is a little less than 2 weeks ago, on a weekend night, shots rang out. And shortly after those shots rang out, 2 people's lives were lost. This is part of a disturbing trend which we've seen not only in my community, not only in the city of Toronto or the GTA, but right across the country. And I think that it's something that all members should be fully grasped with. In Toronto, there were 61 homicides in 2017, many of which were associated with some form of gun violence. In 2018, there have been 28 shooting incidents already reported. This number is up 55% from this point in time last year. And I want to say that this is in spite of the great efforts of local police officers with Toronto Police Services and with many actors within the law enforcement. But the reality is that gun violence is all too common in many neighborhoods, not only in Eglinton Lawrence, but right across the country. One of the victims that, who lost their life just outside of this family establishment had been at an IKEA earlier in the day and had been shopping for a cradle in anticipation of starting their own family. And this person was described as caring and humble. That's one more life that's been snuffed out as a result of gun violence. And it's for this reason that so many within the law enforcement community, within the police community, within the victims' communities have been calling for gun law reform for so long. And Bill C-71 is a response to those calls. It contains practical and balanced reforms, like including mandatory life history background checks, like strengthening controls for the transport of restricted and prohibited firearms, like prohibiting certain firearms that meet the criminal code definition and limiting their circulation through grandfathering, applying a consistent approach to the classification of firearms, and cracking down on unlicensed access to firearms. Together, these reforms prioritize public safety while ensuring practical and fair application to responsible firearms owners. What Bill C-71 does not do in any way, shape, or form is to bring back the federal long gun registry, and I want to make that abundantly clear. Nor do they add any unreasonable measures for law-abiding citizens. They are focused on preventing firearms from falling into the wrong hands and keeping our communities safer. And that's what I'd like to focus my time on today. Mr. Speaker, overall crime rates in this country are much lower than what they were decades ago. But while we are seeing a general downward trend in crime, these statistics don't tell the whole story. There's no question that illegal guns are increasingly finding their way into the hands of criminals and gang members. Handgun thefts have recently jumped up by nearly 40%. Break-ins and illegal sales in Canada are only compounding the problem. Even more concerning, there were 223 firearm-related homicides in Canada in 2016, and that's 44 more than the previous year. And there were nearly 2,500 criminal incidents involving firearms in 2016, which is also a major jump to the tune of a 30% increase since 2013. While some of our largest cities are hardest hit by these statistics, this isn't just an urban problem. Rural and Indigenous communities are also affected. Not every crime can be prevented, but we can and we must take measures to reduce the risks. The first set of proposals we've introduced would help to stop firearms from falling into the wrong hands. These measures would spell out quite clearly that if you are planning on selling or giving a non-restricted firearm, you must verify that the person acquiring it has a valid firearms license. This occurs automatically for restricted and prohibited firearms, and you must confirm that validity with the RCMP. Currently,
Now, if you think you do have rights, one last assignment for you. Next time you're at the computer, get on the internet, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia, in the search field for Wikipedia, I want you to type in Japanese Americans 1942, and you'll find out all about your precious fucking rights, okay? Just when these citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away. And rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're privileges. That's all we've ever had in this country is temporary privileges. And if you read the news even badly, you know that every year the list gets shorter and shorter and shorter. In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens and good standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps.